The satellite feed flickered once, then died. In the operations center beneath Bagram Air Base, Colonel Marcus Webb stared at the black screen where moments before he'd watched 12 Navy SEALs disappear into the Hindu Kush Mountains. The mission was supposed to be routine: extract a high-value target from a Taliban stronghold 48 hours maximum. That was 72 hours ago. "Sir, we've lost all communication with Bravo Team," Sergeant First Class Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with concern. The ops center had gone unnaturally quiet, 24 operators and analysts holding their collective breath. Outside, the Afghan night stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the distant thrum of generators and the occasional roar of F-16s returning from patrol. Webb's jaw clenched as he studied the tactical map. 12 red dots marked the last known position of the SEALs, deep in hostile territory where the mountains formed natural fortresses, and the enemy knew every cave, every ridge, every killing field. The extraction window had closed 6 hours ago. Protocol demanded they wait for official word, but Webb knew what silence meant in these mountains. "What assets do we have available for immediate deployment?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would disappoint him. The nearest quick reaction force was 3 hours out, pinned down by their own firefight near the Pakistani border. Apache gunships were grounded due to a sandstorm moving in from the west. The conventional wisdom said wait for morning, wait for better weather, wait for backup. But 12 Americans were dying in those mountains, and Webb had spent too many nights writing letters to grieving families to accept conventional wisdom. He turned to the communications officer, a young lieutenant whose hands shook slightly as she monitored the radio frequencies. "Keep trying to raise Bravo Team. Every channel, every frequency." The mystery deepened when intercepted Taliban chatter revealed something impossible. According to enemy communications, the SEALs weren't just alive, they were fighting back with surgical precision. Sniper shots from impossible distances, coordinated strikes that suggested military training far beyond standard SEAL capabilities. The Taliban fighters spoke of a ghost, a shadow that killed without sound, without trace. Webb frowned at the intelligence report. Bravo Team's designated marksman was good but not legendary. None of them were, so who was turning the tide in those mountains? Who had transformed a doomed rescue mission into something the enemy feared to approach? As another intercepted message crackled through the speakers, mentioning the silent death from above, Webb realized this wasn't just about extracting SEALs anymore. Someone unexpected had entered the game, and the entire balance of the battlefield was shifting. Captain Lydia "Phantom" Kowalski adjusted her scope for the third time in 10 minutes, compensating for the crosswind that howled through the mountain pass. From her position on the ridgeline, she could see the Taliban fighters moving through the valley below, their muzzle flashes giving away positions they thought were concealed. They had no idea she'd been watching them for 6 hours, cataloging their movements, identifying their leaders, waiting for the perfect moment. Her radio crackled with static, then cleared enough for her to catch fragments of the SEALs' desperate communications. "Taking heavy fire, Rodriguez down, need immediate extraction." The voices belonged to men she'd never met, but their situation was one she knew intimately. Surrounded, outgunned, running low on ammunition and options. Phantom checked her rifle one more time. A modified M24 she'd carried through 3 deployments, its stock worn smooth by her hands, its trigger responsive to the slightest pressure. The weapon was an extension of herself, calibrated to her breathing, her heartbeat, her instinctive understanding of how bullets behaved in the thin mountain air. She'd made shots that other snipers called impossible, earned respect in a community that rarely acknowledged women as equals. But respect hadn't followed her home. The Army had thanked her for her service, then quietly pushed her toward a desk job, suggesting her skills might be better suited to training rather than combat. They'd smiled when they said it, professional smiles that barely concealed their discomfort with a woman who killed more efficiently than most men. So she'd resigned her commission, taken her skills to the private sector, and tried to forget the weight of a rifle in her hands. The mountains of Afghanistan had called her back, though. A security contractor position, they'd said. Escort duty for supply convoys, nothing dangerous. But convoy escorts didn't explain why she was alone on a ridgeline with enough ammunition to outfit a squad, watching Taliban fighters through her scope while Navy SEALs died in the valley below. She steadied her breathing and found her target, a Taliban commander gesturing orders to his men, positioning them for what looked like a final assault on the SEALs' position. At 800 meters in this wind, with the target moving, most snipers wouldn't attempt the shot. Phantom squeezed the trigger. The commander dropped instantly, and the Taliban formation wavered in confusion. Before they could react, Phantom had shifted targets, her rifle speaking again. Another enemy fighter fell, then another. In 30 seconds, she'd eliminated the tactical leadership of an entire assault team, leaving the remaining fighters leaderless and increasingly desperate. Through her scope, she watched the enemy forces scatter, seeking cover that didn't exist. They knew they were being hunted, but they couldn't see the hunter. Dawn was breaking over the Hindu Kush when Phantom finally made radio contact with the trapped SEALs. Her voice cut through the static with unexpected clarity, speaking directly into Chief Petty Officer Marcus Sullivan's headset. "Bravo team, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on your position. Stay low and prepare for immediate extraction support." Sullivan pressed himself deeper into the rocky outcrop that had sheltered his remaining team members through the longest night of their lives. 4 of his men were wounded, ammunition was critically low, and the Taliban had them surrounded on 3 sides. When a woman's voice suddenly offered salvation, his first instinct was disbelief. "Overwatch, identify yourself. What unit are you with?" "Call sign Phantom. I'm freelance, and that's all you need to know right now." Her tone carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I count 9 tangos moving up the South Ridge. They'll be in grenade range in approximately 4 minutes. When I give the word, you move north toward the helicopter landing zone." Sullivan exchanged glances with his team medic, Petty Officer Jackson, who was applying pressure to a shrapnel wound in his own leg while simultaneously treating their radio man. The SEAL team had been trained to trust no one outside their unit, but they were running out of options. "Phantom, we don't have confirmation of any friendly snipers in this area. How do we know you're not?" The crack of a high-powered rifle echoed across the valley, followed immediately by shouting in Pashto as one of the approaching Taliban fighters crumpled. 2 more shots followed in rapid succession, each one finding its mark with mechanical precision. The enemy advance faltered, then broke entirely as fighters sought cover behind rocks that couldn't protect them from a sniper positioned somewhere above. "Still need confirmation." Phantom's voice carried a hint of dry humor that reminded Sullivan of his sister back in Ohio, competent and confident in ways that made men uncomfortable. "I'll keep them busy. You have approximately 10 minutes before they regroup and try a different approach. Use them." Sullivan keyed his radio to the emergency frequency, trying to raise any available extraction assets. The static that answered him was more ominous than enemy gunfire. Without helicopter support, they were trapped on this mountain, dependent on a mysterious sniper whose very existence violated everything he'd been taught about proper military operations. Female snipers were rare enough in conventional forces, and freelance contractors weren't supposed to possess this level of skill. But as another Taliban fighter fell to Phantom's rifle, Sullivan decided that questions about protocol could wait until they were all safely back at base. "Understood, Phantom. We're moving in 2 minutes. And thank you." The silence that followed lasted just long enough for him to wonder if she'd heard him. Then her voice returned, softer now, almost vulnerable. "Just doing my job, Chief. Get your boys home." Colonel Webb received the first confirmed report of sniper activity at 6:30 hours, delivered by a communications specialist who looked like she'd been awake for 3 days straight. The intercepted Taliban radio chatter painted a picture that defied rational explanation. A single shooter had not only halted a coordinated assault on the trapped SEALs, but was systematically dismantling the enemy's command structure. "Sir, the intercepts indicate they've lost at least 8 fighters, including 2 squad leaders and what sounds like a regional commander," Lieutenant Chen reported, her voice hoarse from monitoring communications all night. "They're referring to the shooter as the ghost and some kind of death spirit. Morale appears to be breaking down." Webb studied the tactical display, trying to reconcile the reports with known friendly forces in the area. No military units were authorized for sniper operations in that sector. The nearest Special Operations team was 40 miles away, engaged in their own mission. Yet someone with extraordinary marksmanship skills had materialized in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. "What about private security contractors?" Webb asked, though he suspected the answer. Most security companies employed former military personnel for escort duties and facility protection, not precision shooting in active combat zones. The insurance liability alone would bankrupt smaller firms. "I'm checking with all registered PMCs in the region," Chen replied, typing rapidly on her secure terminal. "But sir, the shooting pattern suggests someone with extensive military training, possibly Special Forces or Marine Scout sniper background. This isn't some contractor with basic firearms training." The implications troubled Webb more than he cared to admit. If an unauthorized sniper was operating in his area of responsibility, it meant either his intelligence network had failed completely or someone was conducting unofficial operations without his knowledge. Both possibilities violated everything he understood about military command structure. His contemplation was interrupted when Chen suddenly straightened in her chair, pressing her headset closer to her ear. "Sir, I'm picking up direct communication between the Sniper and Bravo team. Call sign, Phantom." Webb felt a chill run down his spine. Phantom. He'd heard that call sign before, attached to after-action reports that described shooting performances bordering on the supernatural. A female Army sniper who'd operated in some of the most dangerous areas of Afghanistan and Iraq, accumulating confirmed kills that impressed even veteran Special Forces operators. But Phantom had left the Army, disappeared into the private sector after some kind of incident that remained classified above his clearance level. "Patch me through to their frequency," Webb ordered. "I want to talk to this Phantom directly." As the radio operator established the connection, Webb found himself wondering what had brought a legendary military sniper back to these mountains, and whether her presence was coincidence or part of something larger he didn't yet understand. Phantom's voice reached Colonel Webb through layers of static and encryption, but her words were clear enough to cut through the confusion. "This is Phantom. I assume you're the officer in charge of extracting these SEALs." Webb hesitated for a moment, unsure how to address someone operating outside official channels but clearly saving American lives. Military protocol demanded he establish her credentials and authorization, but tactical reality suggested those questions were secondary to the immediate crisis. "This is Colonel Webb, Joint Operations Command. What's your status, Phantom?" "I have overwatch on Bravo team's position. Enemy forces are regrouping approximately 1 click south of the landing zone. They've called for reinforcements, possibly including RPGs and heavy machine guns. Your extraction window is closing rapidly." Her tone was professional, precise, devoid of the deference usually shown to senior officers. Webb glanced at the tactical display, where red symbols indicated suspected enemy positions based on intercepted communications. If Phantom's assessment was accurate, the SEALs were walking into a trap. "What assets do you have available? Are you part of a larger team?" The pause that followed seemed to stretch across the mountains themselves. When Phantom finally responded, her voice carried a weight that spoke of isolation and self-reliance. "Negative, Colonel. I'm operating independently with limited ammunition and no backup. but I can provide sniper support during extraction if you can get birds in the air." Webb felt the familiar weight of command decisions pressing down on him. Every instinct told him to demand more information, to establish proper chain of custody for this mysterious operator. But 12 Navy SEALs were depending on whatever help they could get, and Phantom had already proven her effectiveness. "Can you hold your position for another 30 minutes? I have rotary assets inbound." "Affirmative, but understand that I'm not operating under your command authority. I'll provide support as long as it serves the mission, but don't expect me to follow orders that compromise effectiveness." The statement wasn't insubordinate. It was simply honest, delivered by someone who'd learned to trust her own judgment above institutional hierarchy. Webb found himself respecting her directness even as it complicated his operational planning. "Understood, Phantom. We'll coordinate through Bravo Team's radio operator, and thank you for what you've done." "Thank me when everyone gets home alive, Colonel." The radio went silent, leaving Webb to wonder who this woman really was and what circumstances had placed her alone on a mountain, fighting a war that officially didn't concern her. Chief Petty Officer Sullivan led his team through terrain that seemed designed to break human bodies and human spirits. Every step required careful placement to avoid loose rocks that might cascade down the mountainside, alerting enemy forces to their movement. 4 of his men were wounded, moving with the determined shuffle of warriors who refused to acknowledge their limitations until the mission was complete. Behind them, Phantom's rifle spoke occasionally, each shot followed by distant shouts of anger and confusion, as Taliban forces found their advance disrupted by an enemy they couldn't locate. Sullivan had fought alongside Marine snipers in Iraq and thought he understood their capabilities, but Phantom was operating on a different level entirely. Her shots weren't just accurate, they were psychologically devastating, targeted to create maximum disruption with minimum ammunition expenditure. "Chief, movement on the ridge line," whispered Petty Officer Jackson, their medic, who despite his own wounds maintained the alertness that kept teams alive. He gestured toward a rocky outcrop where muzzle flashes had appeared sporadically throughout their withdrawal. Sullivan raised his rifle, but before he could acquire a target, the distinctive crack of Phantom's weapon echoed across the valley. The enemy fire ceased immediately, replaced by what sounded like panicked shouting. "Phantom, this is Bravo Actual. Thanks for the assist." "Movement confirmed neutralized," came her reply. "But I'm tracking additional forces moving up from the south. They're trying to flank your route to the LZ. Recommend you adjust course 10 degrees west and increase pace." Sullivan checked his GPS, calculating the adjustment Phantom suggested. It would take them through more difficult terrain, but potentially avoid the ambush being prepared ahead. The decision required trusting someone he'd never met, whose qualifications existed only in the lethal precision of her rifle work. "Team, we're adjusting route as directed by Overwatch," he announced, using hand signals to reinforce his words. His SEALs responded without question, their trust in his leadership extending to his judgment about their mysterious guardian angel. As they climbed toward the new route, Sullivan found himself thinking about the woman behind the call sign Phantom. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who'd faced death repeatedly and emerged victorious. But there was something else, a carefully controlled isolation that suggested she'd paid a personal price for her skills. He wondered what had brought her to these mountains, and whether she understood how completely she'd changed the tactical situation. The sound of approaching helicopters reached them 20 minutes later, the distinctive whop-whop of rotors echoing off mountainsides like mechanical thunder. Sullivan felt the first stirring of hope since their mission had gone wrong, but he knew the most dangerous moments were still ahead. Landing zones in hostile territory were kill boxes waiting to be activated. 2 US-60 Black Hawks approached the landing zone with the aggressive confidence of aircraft, expecting to find enemies waiting. The lead helicopter circled once, its crew chief scanning for threats, while the trail bird established a high orbit to provide suppressive fire if needed. Through her scope, Phantom watched the Taliban forces repositioning themselves for what they clearly expected to be a target-rich environment. She counted at least 15 enemy fighters with small arms, 2 RPG teams, and what appeared to be a heavy machine gun emplacement that commanded the entire landing zone. The tactical situation was exactly what she'd expected. The enemy had used the SEALs as bait to draw American helicopters into a carefully prepared killing field. "Bravo team, this is Phantom," she transmitted on the extraction frequency. "Landing zone is compromised. Multiple enemy positions with heavy weapons. Recommend alternate extraction site." The response came from the lead helicopter rather than the SEALs. "Phantom, this is Hawk 27. We don't have fuel for alternate sites. Can you provide precision fires to clear the LZ?" She studied the tactical problem through her scope, calculating angles, distances, and timing. 15 targets with 1 rifle and limited ammunition was a mathematical challenge that required perfect execution. Miss any of the RPG teams, and the helicopters would become burning wreckage scattered across the mountainside. "Roger, Hawk 27. Give me 2 minutes to thin the opposition, then come in fast and low. Be advised, I cannot guarantee complete suppression." Her voice remained calm despite the impossibility of what she was promising to attempt. Phantom settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing until her heartbeat became a metronome for precision. The heavy machine gun team drew her first shot, its crew chief dropping instantly while his assistant fumbled for the weapon. Her second shot eliminated 1 RPG team before they could acquire the incoming helicopters. The third shot took out the spotter for the remaining RPG team, leaving the gunner blind and confused. By the time the helicopters reached the landing zone, half the Taliban ambush force was neutralized, and the remainder was too disorganized to coordinate effective fire. The SEALs sprinted across open ground toward salvation, their wounded helped by teammates who refused to leave anyone behind. But as the last SEAL reached the helicopter, Phantom realized she'd made herself the primary target for every surviving enemy fighter. Muzzle flashes erupted across the valley, all directed toward her position, and she knew her war was just beginning. The extraction should have ended Phantom's involvement in the mission, but as the Black Hawks lifted off with their precious cargo, she found herself alone on a mountain surrounded by an increasingly organized enemy force. The Taliban fighters who'd survived her initial intervention were no longer focused on the escaping Americans. They were hunting her with the methodical determination of men who'd suffered humiliation and wanted revenge. Through her scope, she watched enemy squads moving to encircle her position. They'd learned from their earlier mistakes, using cover more effectively, coordinating their movements to minimize exposure to her rifle. These weren't the undisciplined fighters she'd encountered at the beginning of the night. They were adapting, and adaptation meant danger. Her radio crackled with an unexpected transmission from Colonel Webb. "Phantom, this is command. Bravo team is airborne and secure. What's your extraction plan?" The question forced her to confront a reality she'd been avoiding. She'd planned for insertion and overwatch, but extraction had always been theoretical. Her employment contract with the security firm covered convoy escort, not combat operations in hostile territory. She was alone by choice and by circumstance, dependent on her own resources and her own skills. "Negative extraction assets available," she replied, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "I'll work my way to an alternate pickup site when tactically feasible." The silence that followed suggested Webb understood the implications. She was trapped on a mountain with limited ammunition, no backup, and an enemy force that now considered her elimination their primary objective. Standard military doctrine would classify her situation as unsurvivable. "Phantom, we can divert resources to support your extraction," Webb offered, though they both knew the nearest friendly forces were hours away. "Give me coordinates and we'll find a way." She checked her map, calculating distances and enemy positions. Even if Webb could arrange helicopter support, reaching any viable landing zone would require crossing terrain now occupied by Taliban forces actively searching for her. The mathematics of survival were simple and unforgiving. Appreciate the offer, Colonel, but I'll handle my own extraction. Phantom out. She switched off the radio before Webb could argue, knowing that well-meaning rescue attempts would likely result in more American casualties. This was her problem now, to be solved with the resources she carried, and the skills she developed through years of operating in places where backup was a luxury few could afford. The first enemy patrol reached her previous position 15 minutes after she'd relocated to a secondary hide site. She watched through her scope as they searched the rocks where her muzzle flashes had originated, their movements betraying a mixture of caution and frustration. They knew they were hunting someone dangerous, but they couldn't quite grasp how dangerous. Night began to fall over the Hindu Kush, and Phantom prepared for the longest fight of her military career. She had 12 rounds remaining, no support, and an enemy force that seemed to be growing rather than diminishing. But she also had something her opponents lacked: patience, precision, and the hard-earned knowledge that sometimes the most important battles were fought alone. As darkness settled across the mountains like a familiar blanket, Phantom began to move. The Taliban fighters hunting her expected a sniper to remain static, to defend a position until overwhelmed. They didn't understand that her greatest weapon wasn't the rifle she carried. It was her ability to become invisible, to move through terrain like a ghost, striking when least expected and vanishing before retaliation was possible. She'd learned this style of warfare during her third deployment, operating with a special forces team that treated conventional tactics as suggestions rather than doctrine. They taught her that survival in hostile territory required thinking like prey and striking like a predator, using the enemy's assumptions against them. Her first target was a two-man observation team positioned on a ridge overlooking her last known location. They were good soldiers, maintaining proper noise discipline and scanning their assigned sectors with professional competence. But they'd positioned themselves skylined against the stars, and their cigarette smoke carried farther than they realized in the thin mountain air. Phantom approached from below, moving one careful step at a time through terrain that would challenge mountain goats. Every placement of hand or foot required conscious thought, every breath controlled to minimize sound. It took her 40 minutes to cover 200 meters, but when she finally had a clear shot, the first Taliban fighter dropped without knowing he'd been targeted. His partner turned at the sound, reaching for his rifle, but Phantom's second shot found him before he could raise the weapon. 2 enemies eliminated with 2 bullets, and her ammunition count dropped to 10 rounds remaining. She collected their weapons and equipment, finding herself momentarily wealthy in ammunition and intelligence. Their radio was tuned to the primary Taliban frequency, allowing her to monitor enemy communications. What she heard confirmed her tactical assessment. They weren't just hunting her anymore. Word had spread that a single American sniper was operating in the region, and Taliban commanders were viewing her elimination as a matter of prestige. The ghost shooter has killed Mahmoud and Hassan, one voice reported in Pashto, using a term that suggested supernatural rather than military threat. She strikes from the darkness and disappears like smoke. Phantom smiled grimly at the unintended compliment. Let them think she was supernatural. Fear was another weapon in her arsenal, potentially more valuable than bullets. Frightened enemies made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. She keyed the captured radio, speaking in the broken Pashto she'd learned during previous deployments. Your friends died quickly. The others will not be so fortunate. The frequency exploded with angry voices, each speaker trying to coordinate responses to this psychological warfare. But coordination required communication, and communication revealed positions. Phantom listened carefully, plotting enemy locations on her mental map of the terrain. By dawn, she would know exactly where to find them. The Taliban's psychological profile suggested they would respond to her radio provocation with increased aggression rather than tactical withdrawal. Phantom counted on this cultural tendency toward honor-based retaliation as she planned her next moves. If they wanted to hunt her, she would give them something to chase. She moved to a position overlooking the main valley, where enemy forces would be forced to travel if they intended to coordinate their search efforts. The location offered excellent fields of fire but limited escape routes, exactly the kind of position a cornered sniper might choose in desperation. She left obvious signs of her presence: boot prints in soft soil, a spent cartridge case positioned where moonlight would reflect off its brass surface. Then she withdrew to an overwatch position 300 meters away and waited. The first Taliban patrol arrived 90 minutes later, their movements betraying the careful overconfidence of hunters who thought they'd found their prey's lair. Phantom counted 6 fighters, including one who carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a military leader. Through her scope, she studied their formation, their equipment, their tactical discipline. These weren't village militia or foreign fighters with more enthusiasm than training. These were Afghan army veterans who'd switched sides after the American withdrawal, men who understood military tactics and could adapt to changing battlefield conditions. Hunting them would require different techniques than she'd used against less sophisticated opponents. The patrol leader deployed his men in a classic Overwatch formation, sending 2 fighters to investigate her false position, while the others provided covering fire from concealment. It was competently executed and professionally disciplined, exactly what she'd hoped to see. Predictable enemies were manageable enemies. She waited until the investigating team reached her abandoned position and began signaling the all-clear. Then she put a bullet through the patrol leader's center mass, watched him drop, and immediately shifted her aim to his radio operator. 2 shots, 2 kills, and the remaining Taliban fighters found themselves leaderless and unable to communicate with their supporting units. The surviving fighters responded exactly as their training dictated, taking cover and attempting to identify her muzzle flash. But Phantom was already moving, using terrain features to mask her withdrawal. By the time they'd coordinated enough courage to advance on her new position, she was observing them from yet another location, calculating the mathematics of their elimination. Her radio, the one she'd taken from the observation team, crackled with increasingly frantic communications as Taliban commanders realized they'd lost another patrol to the ghost shooter. The mythology was building exactly as she'd planned. Fear was spreading faster than tactical information, and fear made enemies vulnerable. But mythology was a double-edged weapon. As word spread of her capabilities, more fighters would be drawn to the hunt. Eventually, sheer numbers would overcome individual skill, no matter how refined. She needed to end this engagement before it became a siege she couldn't survive. Colonel Webb received the updated intelligence report at 400 hours, delivered by a staff officer who looked simultaneously impressed and disturbed by its contents. The Taliban's radio communications suggested their hunting expedition had become a casualty-producing disaster, with multiple patrols eliminated by a sniper who seemed to anticipate their every move. "Sir, intelligence indicates the enemy has lost at least 12 fighters since the SEAL extraction," Major Harrison reported, consulting his notes with professional detachment. "They're referring to the shooter as some kind of supernatural entity, and their tactical communications suggest approaching panic." Webb studied the map, trying to comprehend how a single operator could dominate such a large area against numerically superior forces. Even the most elite snipers typically worked with spotters and support teams. Operating alone against coordinated enemy forces was tactically unsound, theoretically suicidal. "What about Phantom's status? Any communication since last night?" "Negative, sir. She's maintained radio silence except for 2 instances where she apparently used captured enemy equipment to broadcast psychological warfare messages in Pashto. The transcripts are unsettling. Webb raised an eyebrow, inviting elaboration. She told them their friends died quickly, but promised the others wouldn't be so fortunate. Intelligence suggests it caused significant morale problems among Taliban units in the region. The implications troubled Webb more than the tactical reports. Phantom was escalating beyond simple military operations into something that resembled personal warfare. Her actions were effective, but indicated someone operating without the psychological constraints that typically governed professional soldiers. "Sir, there's something else," Harrison continued. "I ran her call sign through our personnel database. Captain Lydia Kowalski, former Army sniper, honorably discharged 18 months ago. Her service record is unusual." Webb waited for details, though he suspected they would only deepen the mystery. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Confirmed kills in triple digits, multiple commendations for actions under fire. But she was passed over for promotion twice and eventually resigned rather than accept a transfer to training duties. Why was she passed over? Harrison's pause suggested the answer involved sensitive personnel issues. The promotion board reports site difficulties with command integration and excessive independence in tactical execution. Reading between the lines, sir, it appears she was too competent for her own good. Webb understood immediately. The military rewarded conformity and predictability, qualities that often conflicted with the intuitive aggression required for exceptional combat performance. Phantom had probably been punished for the same skills that were now saving American lives. Do we have any assets available to support her extraction? Not without risking additional personnel, sir. She's deep in hostile territory with enemy forces actively hunting her. Any rescue attempt would likely result in additional casualties. Webb stared at the map, calculating distances and reaction times, knowing that somewhere in those mountains a woman was fighting alone because the system that had trained her had ultimately failed to value her contributions. Dawn brought fresh challenges as Phantom realized the Taliban had adapted their tactics overnight. Instead of sending small patrols she could eliminate individually, they'd organized a coordinated sweep using multiple teams positioned to provide mutual support. The hunters had learned to think like soldiers rather than warriors, and soldiers were considerably more dangerous. Through her scope, she counted at least 20 enemy fighters moving through the valley in a formation designed to flush her from cover while minimizing their exposure to sniper fire. They'd studied her previous engagements, identified her preferred shooting positions, and developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize her advantages. Her ammunition situation was becoming critical, 6 rounds remaining in her rifle, 2 partial magazines for the AK-47 she'd taken from yesterday's casualties. Against 20 disciplined fighters with military training and professional equipment, her resources were grossly inadequate for conventional engagement. But Phantom had never been conventional. She'd earned her reputation by solving unsolvable tactical problems, by finding ways to win when winning seemed impossible. The current situation was simply another equation requiring unconventional solutions. The Taliban sweep formation assumed she would defend a static position, attempting to hold ground until overwhelmed. Instead, she began moving parallel to their advance, staying ahead of their line while identifying the weak points in their coordination. Every formation had vulnerabilities if you understood how to find them. She located what she was looking for 2 hours after sunrise, a bottleneck where the terrain would force the enemy formation to compress, reducing their mutual support capability. A narrow canyon with steep sides, the kind of terrain feature that tactical manuals warned against entering without proper reconnaissance. Phantom positioned herself on the canyon's rim, checking her remaining ammunition one final time. 6 rifle rounds, 63 rounds for the AK-47. Against 20 fighters, the mathematics were still unfavorable, but the terrain would help balance the equation. She waited until the Taliban advance guard entered the canyon, then opened fire. Her first shot eliminated the lead scout. Her second took down the man behind him. The canyon walls amplified the sound of her rifle, creating echoes that made it impossible for the enemy to determine her exact position. Panic replaced tactical discipline as fighters scattered for cover that didn't exist. The canyon walls were too steep for rapid ascent, and retreat meant exposing themselves to continued sniper fire. They were trapped in a killing field of their own choosing. Phantom switched to the AK-47, using rapid, controlled bursts to maintain suppressive fire while the surviving Taliban fighters realized their tactical situation had become untenable. But even as they withdrew from the canyon, she knew this was only a temporary victory. They would regroup, adapt again, and return with even better tactics. The war of attrition was working against her, and time was becoming her most dangerous enemy. The Taliban's withdrawal from the canyon gave Phantom an opportunity to assess her tactical situation with brutal honesty. She'd eliminated approximately half their force, but the survivors would return better organized and more cautious. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, her physical condition was deteriorating from lack of sleep and food, and her operational area was steadily shrinking as enemy forces learned to anticipate her movements. Most critically, she was beginning to make small mistakes, overlooking a piece of equipment that could reveal her position, miscalculating a distance, taking slightly too long to acquire targets. Combat fatigue was eroding the precision that kept her alive, and exhaustion was a luxury she couldn't afford in hostile territory. Her radio crackled with an unexpected transmission on the emergency frequency. "Phantom, this is Colonel Webb. Are you receiving?" She hesitated before responding, knowing that communication could compromise her position but recognizing her need for intelligence about enemy movements. "This is Phantom. I'm listening. We're monitoring Taliban communications. They're bringing in additional forces from 3 surrounding districts, estimated 40 to 60 fighters, including some with military training and heavy weapons. They're planning a coordinated assault to begin at sunset." The numbers confirmed her tactical assessment. Even under optimal conditions, engaging 60 fighters with her remaining ammunition would be suicidal. But retreat wasn't necessarily possible. They knew the terrain better than she did, and they had the advantage of local support networks. "Phantom, we can provide limited fire support if you can designate targets," Webb continued. "Artillery or close air support, but we need precise coordinates." She considered the offer while scanning the surrounding terrain through her scope. Fire support could balance the tactical equation, but it would also confirm her exact position to enemy forces. Once they knew where she was, concentration of force would overwhelm any defensive position she could establish. "Negative, Colonel. Fire support would compromise my mobility. I'll handle this situation independently." Webb's pause suggested he understood the implications. "Phantom, with respect, the numbers don't support independent operations. You're facing overwhelming odds." "I've faced overwhelming odds before," she replied, though privately she acknowledged this situation was different. Previous engagements had offered escape routes, support options, alternative tactical approaches. Here, surrounded by enemy forces in terrain that favored the defenders, her options were narrowing toward a single, unpalatable conclusion. "What's your plan?" Webb asked. Phantom studied the map, calculating distances and timing for what might be her final tactical decision. "I'm going to make them regret coming to hunt me." The radio went silent, leaving her alone with the approaching sunset and the certainty that the next few hours would determine whether she left these mountains alive or became another casualty of a war that officially didn't involve her. As shadows lengthened across the Hindu Kush, Phantom made her final preparations for what military theorists called a last stand, but what she preferred to think of as tactical problem-solving under extreme conditions. She'd selected a defensive position that maximized her advantages while acknowledging the mathematical reality of her situation. She couldn't win a conventional engagement, but she might be able to make victory so costly that her enemies would prefer negotiation to continued combat. Her chosen position occupied a rocky outcrop with clear fields of fire in 3 directions and a steep cliff behind her that prevented enemy flanking movements. It was the kind of terrain feature that looked defensible on maps but became a trap once enemy forces achieved numerical superiority.